Over the last few years, we've had a lot of farmers around the country calling us saying, hey, Roundup isn't working in my corn. What should I throw along with my Roundup to kill all these Roundup resistant weeds in corn? Well, fortunately, most of those weeds are broadleaf weeds. And you know what? It's pretty easy to kill broadleaf weeds in corn, so we have a lot of options for you.
Well, I think not only are they saying Roundup isn't working in my corn, they're just saying Roundup isn't working in my system on these broadleaf weeds. And you know what? I want to have cotton or I want to have soybeans in my rotation, and I just can't be successful in those crops if I don't completely wipe the weeds out in corn. You know, when you have corn or wheat in the rotation, there is zero excuse to let a broadleaf weed go. We've got lots of good products that we can do. If you're not killing all the broadleaves in your corn, switch products, switch programs, because there's better choices out there.
Now, before we go into our post-emerge recommendations, I want you to think back, what did you use pre-emerge? What I'm trying to say here is we really don't want you to use the same chemical family twice. The other thing you need to consider is, what did I use for an insecticide at planting time? If you used counter insecticide, we really don't want you using any ALS. Just make sure you're talking to your agronomist so he knows, hey, I use this for an insecticide, this is what I use for a pre, now give me the best recommendation possible post-emerge.
The other thing that we talk about with pre-emerge herbicides versus post is atrazine. If you've already used some atrazine with a pre-emerge herbicide, you can't use any post, but if it still is an option post-emerge to use some atrazine, most of them will actually work better if you put a quarter to a half a pound of atrazine with them, if you can do that in your rotation and your soil conditions.
All right, I want to mention before we get into some of the main ones, just a couple other things you might not have thought about, like Buctril, for example. You might say, well, I haven't used Buctril in 20 years. Well, that may be, but let's keep in mind, Buctril is good on wild buckwheat, and we do have some weaknesses in a lot of different programs where wild buckwheat just isn't controlled perfectly. You can tank mix Buctril together with some of these other products if you wanted to get a little more kick on wild buckwheat. Okay, so the product I prefer, if a guy says, well, I don't know exactly what kind of weeds I got all of them, and they're big, I'd probably go out there with Status. Status, I think, is great. It's got a little bit of dicamba in there. The main product in there, though, is diflufenzapyr. You can't buy that straight, by the way. But anyway, this Status is excellent. The problem is it's sold out all over the country. So if you lucked out, you got your Status, excellent. Otherwise, chances are next year there will be plenty available. It's just in really tight supply this year. If you can't get Status, what I would suggest to you is you might consider using some old Banville or Clarity. I don't like those as well. The Status does have a corn safener in there, so it's going to make it a lot safer for the crop. But I'll tell you this, with Loudus, it's got the same corn safener, isoxadyphon, that Status does. So literally what you could do is take Loudus, put a little bit of Banville or Clarity in there, and in effect, because of that corn safener, you've now safened your dicamba. It's just something for you to consider if you can't get Status in your area.
If you're trying to avoid all the issues that come up with dicamba, like volatilization and drift, you may just go with an HPPD product all by itself. Again, Loudus, Impact, Callisto, Armazon, those products are very good. They're pretty crop safe, so you can spray them on a little taller crop than what you could spray just a straight dicamba on. And many guys like that, especially when we're putting in a fungicide, say at that V5 to V7 timing. Well, you can wait until about that stage and spray your HPPD at the same time if you don't have a whole lot of weeds coming.
Okay, but the problem with the HPPDs, they are a little weak on the viney species like wild buckwheat. So that's where throwing Buctril in might help, throwing a little atrazine in would help. But again, we're talking Callisto, Loudus, Armazon, and Impact. Now, Impact, because of the rebate with Roundup, it's going to be the least expensive. But it just depends on what else you're using on your farm. Maybe there's some other tie-in rebate that's going to lower your price. You really want to work with your retailer and your agronomist, because those four products are very, very similar, all in the same chemical family, same weeds they're going to kill. You kind of have to look at, well, which one is really going to dollar out the least expensive for me and my farm.
So again, there are a lot of choices for broadleaf control in corn. Just make sure you're choosing products that are going to completely wipe out the weeds you have, especially if they're Roundup resistant. That way, in your next rotation, you don't have as many weeds to fight.
Well, speaking of weeds, we've got a tough one. It's coming up next.